The President has requested $526.6 billion in funding for DOD, with a third going to operations, one-third going to personnel costs, and the remaining third used for investments. The President has also requested an additional $79.4 billion in overseas contingency operations funding for DOT. While the base budget request is essentially flat-lined, the Department is in a complicated position. They are finally ending the war in Afghanistan, implementing a new national security strategy, executing the pivot to Asia, and preparing for a range of potential problems, including North Korea, Iran, Syria, and the ungoverned spaces and extreme poverty that breed conflict. All of this has to be done with limited resources while facing continued sequestration. Secretary Hagel, clearly you have a very difficult task in front of you. A wide range of options have been put forward by many different groups to help meet these strategic goals while dealing with the budget constraints. None of them are easy, but I look forward to discussing them today, and I'm especially interested in the findings of your strategic choices and management review. I also want to highlight one of the Department's challenges in particular. After ending the war in Iraq, we are also finally winding down the war in Afghanistan. As we close out these campaigns, it is appropriate to draw down the funding that will no longer be needed. But this must be done responsibly by finding the right balance between capabilities and capacity. At the same time, Congress needs to begin the process of modifying and repealing the authorization for the use of military force. Overall, I support the President's commitment to that end, but this discussion is still in the early stages. We need to be sure that when we are ready to roll back the authorization, there is an appropriate and effective legal framework in place. The new laws must be flexible enough to deal with rapidly changing events and our continuing efforts to protect the country from terrorists and atypical threats while pulling back authorities that are only appropriate during wartime. As we prepare for that discussion, I'm very concerned about the effects sequestration is having now. And I'm even more concerned about the long-term impact it will have if we can't come together to replace it. Civilian defense employees are being furloughed. The Air Force has now grounded 31 squadrons, and by the end of the fiscal year, 2/3 of Navy ships and squadrons will not be combat ready. And the Marine Corps believes a little less than half its combat units will not be combat ready by the end of the year, which is troubling to hear from the nation's forces expected to respond to any situation at a second's notice. This shouldn't be difficult. Our colleague Senator McCain has called sequestration, quote, devastating to our military. Speaker Boehner has talked about how it would, quote, hollow our military. Democrats agree sequestration is a terrible way to cut defense spending, the same way it's a terrible way to cut spending on education, health care, and other national investments. That's why the Senate budget takes a measured and fair approach to completely replace the sequester with a balanced mix of revenue and spending cuts, and it's why I believe one of our highest priorities right now should be coming together to get this done for the American people. We could be well on our way to a compromise budget resolution. It has now been 81 days since the Senate passed our budget resolution. Since then, Republican leadership in the Senate and a minority of senators have held this process hostage. Let's be clear, their obstructionism not only defies common sense, but it is dangerous. I just described some of the most serious ways sequestration threatens our national security, and I imagine we'll hear more of that today. Secretary Hagel and General Dempsey, we know these cuts will make it incredibly hard for you and our men and women in uniform to protect the country. That's why Democrats have gone to the floor of the Senate 12 times now to ask consent to go to conference so we can move forward with fully replacing the sequester in order to protect our men and women in combat and our future readiness. We've been joined by Republicans like Senator McCain and Senator Collins, and many more have expressed public opposition to their leader's obstruction. But unfortunately, each time we have now been blocked. We want to do the right thing, talk and debate the issues with our House counterparts openly and follow regular order. Republicans have spent years saying the biggest problem was the Senate not passing a budget. Now that we've passed one, they're running away from regular order as quickly as they can, and this is especially disappointing to me since Republican brinkmanship is how we ended up with this sequestration in the first place. Continuing to manufacture crisis is the only way to make the situation worse for the defense budget. Refusing to work together or compromise will force the Pentagon to deal with strict, across-the-board sequester cuts in future years, instead of the relative flexibility they would have in meeting lower spending limits under a budget and appropriations bill enacted through regular order. So I am hopeful that Republicans end their latest push towards brinkmanship and join us at the table in a budget conference under regular order. And I want to be clear, I join the President and Leader Reid and others in this. We are not going to negotiate over the debt limit. The United States is not going to default on our debt, and we aren't going to let Republicans play political games with the global economy. We are still trying to fix the problems that were caused the last time that was tried in 2011. We cannot allow it to happen again. To that end, the Senate budget resolution calls for $552 billion in discretionary defense spending in fiscal year 14 and for $5.9 trillion over 10 years. The resolution also includes several reserve funds that allow for additional funding so long as it's offset appropriately. The Senate amount is significantly higher than the sequester levels, as well as the major bipartisan budget plans like the Simpson-Bowles Commission. Now, after years of growth in the base defense budget from $287.4 billion in fiscal year 2001 to $527.5 billion in fiscal year 2013, these reductions in growth will be significant. But they can be accomplished hand in hand with our military strategy and our need to ensure readiness for the current and future threats. There are still options available to meet these spending targets, and I hope we can work together to budget for the Defense Department with a focus on real threats, real needs, and common sense. The Department needs to be re-examining how it can get the effects it needs as efficiently as possible, continue efforts to improve procurement to control costs and reduce waste, and work with Congress to determine how to balance force structure, modernization, readiness, and care for our service members and families. Most importantly, the Senate's defense level is also part of an overall framework that would take a balanced, fair, and responsible approach to our budget by raising revenues, finding mandatory spending savings, and by cutting both defense and non-defense discretionary spending. On the other hand, the House approach, I believe, is the wrong way to go. In order to keep defense spending at the pre-sequester levels, Congressman Ryan's plan slashes other key areas of the budget. For example, international affairs funding, which is a vital part of our overall national security efforts, would be gutted under the House budget. Marine Corps Major General James Mattis recently testified, quote, "If you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately." He's absolutely right, and I'm very concerned that this type of unbalanced approach could have serious consequences. Aside from the budget differences, there are several policy areas we need to address. Secretary Hagel and General Dempsey, I know you agree that the greatest strength of our military is the character and dedication of our men and women who wear the uniform. Our service members volunteer to face danger, to put their lives on the line, to protect our country and its people. But there are some dangers that cannot be accepted, and none of our courageous service members should ever have to face. Sexual assault has no place in our military. It goes for everything our services stand for. It is absolutely unconscionable that a fellow service member, the person you trust to have your back and be there for you, would commit such a terrible crime. Worse is the prevalence of these crimes. The number of sexual assault cases has increased by more than 1/3 since 2010. And of the estimated 26,000 cases in 2012, less than 3,000 service members reported these crimes. Of those who bravely came forward to report the abuse, an astounding 62% of them were retaliated against in one way or another. That is absolutely unacceptable. Equally troubling are the multiple reports of these crimes being committed by the very people, those who are responsible for preventing sexual assault and helping victims. In fact, just last Saturday, we learned the Army suspended the general in command of all Army forces in Japan over allegations that he failed in his duties to report and investigate a sexual assault. This is an appalling situation that seems to get worse by the day. We need a cultural overhaul. We need to create a system where the protection and safety of victims is unquestionable, a system where those who commit these crimes and those who allow for this behavior are punished. Secretary Hagel, you have taken some steps to help combat these terrible betrayals of trust, and we all really appreciate that. But it's also time for Congress to act on legislation to give victims the protections they deserve to seek justice, and which gives the Pentagon the tools to deal with this growing crisis. I believe the solution starts with a dedicated legal counsel, specifically for victims, that is with them every step of the way through what is a deeply personal and painful process, which is exactly what Senator Ayotte, who's on this committee, and I have proposed in bipartisan legislation. And I want to especially thank Senator Ayotte for being such an outstanding partner on this and for all she's done to push this bill forward. In addition to endorsements from important groups like the Servicewomen's Action Network and the Military Officers Association, our bill now has 37 co-sponsors and strong support from both parties, which should tell you we're doing the right thing. Our bill is the Combating Military Sexual Assault Act. It's aggressive and it's effective. It makes critical improvements to attack this unconscionable issue from several angles by empowering victims with special military lawyers to help guide them through the legal process. It prohibits sexual contact between instructors and trainees during basic training to make sure the terrible things we saw at places like Lackland Air Force Base and Aberdeen Proving Grounds will not happen again. And the bill also ensures members of the National Guard and Reserves will always have access to sexual assault response coordinators. And finally, it ensures sexual assault charges receive fair, thorough consideration, sending them to only the highest courts-martial. This will ensure that no individual member of the chain of command can misuse their authority to deny justice and hurt the victim. The provisions of this bill were put together very carefully. I believe it works with the steps that you and the services are taking. It will be effective and will get to the heart of the sexual assault problem. This is a legislation that is workable and will make a difference. And General Dempsey, I was pleased to see you give your support to the central provisions of our bill providing special victims counsels to victims of sexual assaults during the SASC hearing last week, and I thank you for that. In addition to combating sexual assault, there is much work to do to be done in providing adequate mental health care to our service members and their families. And I'm pleased to see in your testimony today that the Department's fiscal year 14 request would protect funding for mental health care. There are several different initiatives to expand access to care, including some being piloted in my home state of Washington. I look forward to hearing more from you about the effectiveness of those programs and which should be expanded to help more service members. One of the key initiatives that needs to stay on track is the DoD-wide review of the mental health care, which I asked Secretary Panetta to begin. A similar review by the Army has provided very important lessons, but I still have some concerns, and that's why completing the DoD-wide review to identify gaps in care improvements must be made. Secretary Hagel, as we discussed yesterday, that review needs to be completed soon, and I look forward to hearing from you on the response to that. We also need to improve our understanding of suicide and efforts to prevent it. The Army recently released data showing there have already been 109 potential suicides this year in the Army alone, compared to 49 Army casualties in Afghanistan. This is an absolute tragedy, not only because of how many we've had this year, but because each year the number of suicides goes up. Hometowns should never be more lethal than the battlefield, and we have to be working to turn this around. Developing a seamless transition is another challenge that VA and DoD continue to face, though important progress has been made. This will be even more important as the war in Afghanistan now winds to a close and you begin to right-size our military forces. I have worked with the Department to make the Transition Assistance Program mandatory. Along with a major overhaul of the curriculum, this has created a much more useful tool to assist service members leaving the military. I look forward to additional components and improvements that are coming. Other requirements to expand job opportunities, eliminate barriers to getting civilian licenses and credentials are key to combating the unemployment rate for veterans, which is still far too high. And I'd like to hear from you about what you're doing to collaborate with our states and the private sector to bring our training and license requirements closer together. We've made a lot of progress working with employers to help them hire veterans, and I will continue to work to engage our private partners to help them understand the skills that veterans bring to the table and why they make some of our best employees. Helping our service members transition into education programs, good jobs, or starting small businesses doesn't just benefit the service member, it helps us grow our economy and the middle class and builds on the investments we've made in our newest veterans as they continue to help our communities, our businesses, and our fellow veterans. I also want to continue working with you on the significant improvements needed in the Integrated Disability Evaluation System, IDES. In particular, this means developing an end-to-end technology solution to get service members through this process quickly and accurately. I wrote to Deputy Secretary Carter in June of last year calling for the departments to develop a solution, but the goal is still a very long way off, and there are other steps we need to make to improve the success that we will work with VA on, such as ensuring they provide sufficient exams for the PEB decisions. I'm also concerned about the effort to develop systems to allow communication between the VA and DOD's medical records. Clearly, the best option would have been a single joint electronic health care record system that is open source. That would have been the most effective solution. It would have revolutionized the market. But the Department has backed away from that goal, and I think everyone in this room is concerned that you spent hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer dollars and thousands of staff hours over the last few years trying to create an integrated IT platform with the VA, only to announce you were unable to find a solution. Now, I know there are significant questions about how to move forward, but I expect that you and Secretary Shinseki will clearly define a plan and ensure leadership remains behind this important project. The lack of seamless integration between our two largest departments is one of the most critical areas to address in order to reduce costs, increase efficiencies, and make sure our service members and their families get the care they need and deserve. Overall, considering the serious budget challenges we face, now more than ever, we must finally have effective collaboration between the Department of Defense and the VA. It is not easy to get the government's two largest bureaucracies to work together efficiently. This is a common theme in many of the areas that I just discussed. It will require your direct attention, including evaluating whether the entities tasked with overseeing VA-DOD collaboration are effective. But with a former Deputy Administrator of VA as the Defense Secretary, and with the former Secretary of the Army now heading the VA, we should be well positioned to make progress. With that, thank you very much for all of you for being here today, for your service to the country. And with that, I will turn it over to my ranking member, Senator Sessions, for his opening statement.